national column, GetMoreSports.com. Of course, he covers the Eagles for 97.3 ESPN.com. So a little national, little local, with a ton of NFL in the mix here. The NFL owners have passed a new Anthem Policy. We'll get John's take on that. They've also got new rules concerning the kickoff. They tried to clarify this helmet rule, which I'd love to get both your opinion on, Bill, and John's opinion, who, of course, covers the league and a lot of Eagles stuff out there as well. I guess let's start. We talked a lot about Foles, so let's start there, John. Report out there that said the Eagles had the offer of the 35th pick from Cleveland for Nick Foles, and essentially Nick did not want to go to Cleveland, and that got shot down. Give me your opinion on that whole situation. Number one, was that a deal that was juicy enough for Philadelphia to accept, or did they do the right thing by listening to Foles' request to not want to go there?
No, they didn't do the right thing, certainly by listening to his request. Now, you have to assume that that's what went down. I don't believe that for a second. I don't believe the Eagles would turn down a deal just because the player didn't want to go there. So that's number one. From the Eagles' standpoint, though, they've been pretty above board, pretty upfront about saying they wanted a Sam Bradford-like haul for Nick Foles, and that would include a first-round pick, obviously, and then perhaps potentially something else, fourth-round pick in Bradford's case. From that standpoint, I've said many times on the show, I think they were overshooting. It was never going to happen. It didn't happen. So I believe the Eagles turned down the 35th overall pick. I don't think they should have, but that's where they are. And we kind of talked about it yesterday with Michael Kendricks. Nick Foles is in the same boat. He is a luxury. He's an insurance policy. He's a really, really nice insurance policy. It's one of the best insurance policies you could possibly have. But if all goes to plan, same with Kendricks, he's not going to play next year. He's not going to play the year after that. So if you have a chance to garner the 35th pick in the draft, which is 3 slots outside of the first round, you can get a significant talent. Ronald Jones was there, player the Eagles I know were very interested in, picked at 37th overall. So in theory, you could have had him there, who would have been very, very impactful, at least had a chance to be impactful for this team. I think they made a mistake, but I don't think they made the mistake because Nick Foles said he didn't want to go there.
So you're saying that Howie Roseman didn't think that deal was good enough? I don't know that I believe that.
Well, Howie Roseman is the one on the record. He said he wants a first-round pick, and he's not going to give him away. And that's where I said, did he overshoot? No question about it, especially when you look at the landscape. We've talked about that in the past as well. This was not the typical year when it came to quarterbacks. Normally, there's an incredible dearth on the open market. There were significant pieces on the free agent market, some very good, starting with Kirk Cousins, down to some mediocre, but they were at least viable. There were people available on the trade market, and there ended up being 5 first-round picks. So there were far more options that limited some of the value. If you look at when Sam Bradford was traded right before the regular season, there are no other options. That increased his value. So to me, it was simple supply and demand. They were never going to get a first-round pick, but that's what Howie wanted, and he's been very honest about that.
Well, John, this is Billy Osborne. So that's something that I was pointing out. So do you believe, knowing that scenario, because that's what I said, even though they didn't get what they wanted or potentially wanted, Nick's value is not going to drop between now and the start of the season. And when teams are playoff caliber teams and they lose a starting quarterback, the first thing they start looking at is teams' backups. And that's when you can really get value, because even though there's a certain value on your team, it's like selling a house. The house is valued at this much, but if you have 10 people vying for the house, you're going to be able to get a little bit more than what it probably is valued at. Don't you think that they'll be able to get at least that if something happens in the preseason or the start of the season for a playoff caliber team that loses their quarterback?
Well, it has to be the right situation, and the odds of that are against it. So I would kind of disagree the value is going to be there. The odds say it's probably not going to be there because it does have to be a playoff contender. It's got to be a contender that doesn't have an option. Say if it's Baltimore and Joe Flacco running for a playoff spot, well, they're not going to trade for Nick Foles when they have Lamar Jackson, even though he might help them in the short term more. In fact, there's a little question he would. They're not going to do it.
Well,
so you have to find the right situation. And if you look at Minnesota real quick, that was the perfect situation. The Vikings thought they were a Super Bowl contender. Their backup quarterback was Sean Hill. They needed someone, and that's why the value was raised for Sam Bradford.
Who was their other quarterback? Didn't they have another big-name quarterback on their roster, too? Or they end up picking him up? Because I thought...
Well, Teddy Bridgewater was hurt.
Yeah, I know that.
That's the reason they were desperate, and then Sean Hill was the backup. So
there was another big name on that team. There was I'm going to Google that. I thought that Minnesota had another name quarterback.
That might have been this year. They had the three guys.
Yeah, that was this year with Case Keenum, Teddy Bridgewater, Sam Bradford.
Got it.
The Sam Bradford year, remember, Sean Hill started the opener, and they won. I think they beat Tennessee. But they knew Sean Hill at the time was a 35, 36-year-old guy. He didn't have a lot of upside. As I said, they thought they were a legitimate Super Bowl contender, and they probably would have been with a healthy Teddy Bridgewater. So they were in a position to say, we can't give up on this season. We're desperate. We're going to give you this first-round pick. What I'm saying is it's very, 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 add as many varies as you want, unlikely that the same scenario is going to happen this August. It's just unlikely to happen.
I personally think that Bradford, I think the Eagles have a year to get similar, better, or close value, because right up until next year's draft, because you always have teams, we were just talking about the Herschel Walker and the Ricky Williams, some teams that just believe they're one player away. Next year's draft supposedly is not that great in quarterbacks. So I think that if, and you're never not going to have the name 2017 Super Bowl champion MVP. So unless he really shoots himself out of in the preseason or a game, I think the Eagles are in a position where they could get what they want potentially, but also have that backup that if their quarterback goes down, they have a backup. But like you said, it has to be the right situation. And, we're looking into the crystal ball, and you know what they say about opinions. They're like,
well, and I say, I said to John, to Billy earlier, John, I tend to agree with you. I don't know that I think that another team, unless Billy's scenario comes up, which I think is a low percentage chance.
Yeah, that's what John says too. It has to. I mean, it can happen, but the percentages are low. I hear.
Yeah, I would say the percentages are low for that. But if that did happen, you may be able to get a better deal. But I don't know that you're going to get someone to pick up the phone and, on the surface, in a normal scenario, give you a better deal than what the Browns offered, right? I mean, do you see 35 was the ceiling?
Yeah, I do, and I think it was, by the way, a very, very good ceiling for this particular quarterback. And one thing I didn't bring up as well, and whether you want to believe this or not, and I tell you this a lot, Mike, personnel people in this league, and I'm laughing, but they think Sam Bradford at that time was better than Nick Foles is at this time. You can disagree with it, but that he's always been the white whale of personnel people in this league. And people who do this for a living are not going to get caught up in a 2-game, 3-game run and a Super Bowl MVP on the resume. They're going to go back and look at the film with the Rams, look at the film with the Eagles before, and see a marginal quarterback. Does he deserve to be a starter in this league? No question. But if you're going to rate the starters from 1 through 32, I got news for you. Nick Foles is in the bottom half of that, maybe in the bottom 10. That's just the reality. So people look at Sam Bradford and his arm talent, and remember, this was before the latest knee injury and the chronic issues, and they said, if I can just get this guy, we can turn the corner. They do not think of Nick Foles in that same way.
John McMullen at JF McMullen. Let's get into By the way, you wrote about Michael Kendricks a little bit more in depth. I want to give you the opportunity to further, because yesterday when this happened, it was literally happening as you were on the phone with us. So now that you got a chance to collect your thoughts, do a little bit more digging, you wrote about it at 973ESPN.com, digging a little deeper, examining the reasons behind Michael Kendricks' release.
Well, the reasons are strictly financial. I mean, the Eagles think he's a very good player. But they also understand, as we said yesterday on the show, in the modern NFL, only 2 linebackers play all 3 downs and are full-time players. And when Jordan Hicks is healthy, and he's going to be this year, hopefully, throughout, and Nigel Bradham is back, Michael's not going to play. He's going to play 25 to 30% of the snaps in the base defense, and then you're going to go into nickel for the rest of the time. So to pay a guy like that $7.6 million against your cap for a team that had $100,000, that's not a misquote, $100,000 before this money comes off the cap, that's just not financially tenable. They would have liked to have kept him, but as I wrote, and the same thing I said with Nick Foles, they made a different decision, and that's every decision sort of a butterfly effect. They kept the insurance policy with Nick Foles, who's tremendously highly paid for a backup quarterback. They couldn't afford it any longer with Michael Kendricks. They just can't afford it. And they've already made their moves. They did it in the offseason, and they signed Corey Nelson. They signed Paul Warlow. Unfortunately, he tore his ACL. Warlow, he's going to be out for the year, so that already hurt. But these were the moves because they understood they were trying to trade Michael. If they couldn't trade him, they were always going to release him, and that came to fruition, as it normally does when you start up. You remember Evan Mathis a couple of years back when they finally traded him. They didn't want him to show up at practice, and Michael's not happy with the situation, so they pulled the trigger yesterday.
John, let's real quick get into some of the new rules. I know you have been talking about the use of the helmet and how it was going to be enforced. Well, they tried to explain it yesterday. Last night they put out these new rules and the explanation. Did they clear it up?
Well, I don't think it's going to, as I said, I don't think it's going to be fully cleared up till we see how they're going to call it on the field in a real environment. But, yes, they finally at least defined it, which I said, this league amazes me. They did it again today. This league could screw up a cup of coffee. I mean, they did it with the national anthem today. They've done it with the helmet rule when they implemented it before defining it. It's just silly. But again, I don't think it's going to be as big as a deal as it was made out to be at first. I think it's going to be very similar to the college targeting rule, which I don't necessarily like, but it's not tremendously burdensome on the game. I think it's going to ultimately end up similar to that, but we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, new kickoff rules as well, which it seems like they're trying to make the kickoff more like a punt, for the most part.
Exactly. And, it's interesting because another thing I say about the NFL is they're really bad forecasting unintended consequences. They only think sort of in a very linear way. They don't think about all the things that come into effect from changing something. And when you talk about making the kickoff into more of a sort of punt play, and that's what it'll turn out to be with all these rule changes, well, what's that going to do? That's going to encourage more kickoffs instead of touchbacks. Now they're trying – remember –
the Patriots do that a lot. They kick it short of the end zone so that you have to take it out.
Correct. And this is all safety-based initiatives, and you're trying to increase the touchbacks for years to take the kickoff out of the game because it's the most dangerous play. Well, yeah, you might not have these big men running full speed at that kind of rate, but you're going to have more football plays because people are going to want to put the ball in play, cover kicks, or even return them from the other perspective, and you're going to have more plays than you had before, which from a safety standpoint is probably not good. But the NFL doesn't think that way. And I've said from the start of this, 2 years from now, mark it down, there will be no kickoff in the NFL.
And, Bill, I'd like to hear your reaction on that when we have a little bit more time. Before we get to that, first, the Anthem Policy, they made a statement today. You just said the reaction to something today that they could mess up a cup of coffee. Did they mess this one up? It sounds as if they kind of weaseled their way out of taking any responsibility of this and said, teams, you go ahead and deal with this.
Yeah, pretty much. And then they of course announced it was unanimous, and Jed York already came out and said he abstained, which from a semantic standpoint, it could still be unanimous. But Christopher Johnson of the Jets had already said he's going to pay any potential fines for players who want to continue to protest. And for me, the larger perspective is this story was gone anyway. It was gone. Nobody was interested in it anymore. Except for a very, very small niche. Nobody was paying attention to it as far as TV. If you remember at the start of this, there was tremendous publicity as far as the television coverage. If you watch at the end of last year, there was barely any. It was in the rearview mirror, and here the NFL does something to screw it up. It's amazing to me. This league can make as much money as it does and make consistent bad decisions, and it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on. And it's interesting because, Mike, we probably talked about this 2 years ago when it started, and I said there's a simple fix. Everybody who's on the field has to stand for the anthem, and if they don't, tell them to stay in the locker room. That's ultimately their decision. It took them 2 years to do something with common sense, and I point to the NBA. Remember, the NBA has had no issue whatsoever because they already had it in the rule book that you have to stand for the national anthem. Now, nobody's had a problem with it. Nobody has fought with them over it. In the NFL, they didn't have that, so they wrote the rule wrong. And instead of just fixing it through collective bargaining, they create all this angst, and that's where we are. It's really kind of amazing.
Yeah, apparently the new rule, by the way, is if you're on the field, you must stand, but you can elect to not come out on the field and sit back in the locker room and wait. So essentially they're saying if you're somebody who wants to demonstrate, you're going to have to demonstrate. Your demonstration will be that you're not out there, essentially. And if you do demonstrate, you will be fined.
Yeah, and I understand. To me, this is very simple. And the fact, if you think about, and you can look at any sport. Remember, when you have that uniform on, go to the New York Yankees, who have this archaic rule, still to this day. Many people might not know this. But if you want to be a member of the New York Yankees, you can't have facial hair or you can't have your hair down below your ears. Now, that sounds like a rule from the 1950s. They still use it today. I don't know why. I don't care why. But it's a rule, and that's what they put in, and that's their right. While you're wearing that uniform. While you're wearing an NFL uniform, NBA uniform, Major League Baseball uniform, you have to conform to certain rules. They're not only involving the national, there's literally hundreds of rules NFL players follow every day that they don't even think about. From the uniform rules that are, people laugh at those, but they're in place because they have significant merchandising deals with different companies, and they can't violate them. There's always a thought behind it. And in this case, they're concerned about the television ratings. They're concerned, obviously, about the revenue, and they would prefer that people stand if they're going to be on the field. If you don't want to, you can protest in other ways. But
we already have a discrepancy in this. Okay, you can't kneel. But what if you're a Malcolm Jenkins? I mean, he's a guy who stood on the sideline, fist in the air. Is there anything in today's
Well, it's funny you bring that up because, no, there isn't. And one of the owners, I think, was
Art Rooney, came out and said, if you have a raised fist, that's disrespect. You should be fined for that. But that's not written in the new policy.
No, nor is interlocking arms, which he also said, I believe. Point again, similar with the helmet rule. This is a league that doesn't think before it acts. And they have to put these in words. And if they put it in words correctly the first time, like the NBA, they would have never had this problem. If they just would have done it correctly from the get-go. But we are where we are. And there are so many ways they could have tackled this. They could have went to their TV partners, who, remember, pay them $7 billion a year. So they're very interested in the ratings being good. And they could have just said to them, look, guys, this is not going well with at least some parts of the public. So please don't televise this. They would have agreed
that's
to
the
that.
biggest thing. If they just say, guys, we don't even have to make this a spectacle. Don't televise it. No one will know what's going on. Right?
Exactly.
I mean, isn't that the biggest thing here is that people are putting them on television and they're getting the attention from it. The NFL did release their statement on the new Anthem policy, which already has cracks in it. So we'll dive into more of that coming up. Of course, at JF McMullen, a lot of NFL news and the Eagles at OTAs continuing. John has more on that at 973ESPN.com. His NFL coverage at GetMoreSports.com. Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys.